If you think about it, and the anger and the underlying dissatisfaction that builds up, if they occupy a role of power, there is risk of them bringing that displaced emotion into their role of power and actually becoming the persecutor. So you can actually have those people who are maybe victims in one circumstance actually become persecutors in a different circumstance. Welcome back to another episode. Thank you, as always, for tuning in, for being a loyal listener. And if you are new to this podcast, welcome. I invite you to go ahead and take a moment to follow this podcast, to subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss any of these conversations, either these mind remapping moments, short episodes, or some of the ones that we have with our esteemed and lovely guests that we have. And so this year, I've been revisiting trauma and all of the ways that trauma can show up. I've talked about it in the context of grief. I've talked about it in the context of trust with my lovely guest, Dr. Amber Banks. If you haven't listened to that episode, please go back and listen to it. We have some more guests coming up. At the time of this podcast, likely we've had one of our wonderful returning guests, Jamie Green, who is a trauma responsive coach. And so we are talking about trauma because, well, it is somewhat a part of everyone's experience, a universal experience. And we are experiencing a lot of trauma now in the world and in our nation. But really, I just wanted to represent what can happen when we experience trauma. And we've been looking at all the ways that it can show up. And so as I was reflecting on what I wanted to talk about today, what came up for me is the ways in which we interact and the roles that we can sometimes play inside of dynamics, unhealthy dynamics. And so one of these dynamics is the drama triangle. And this is a social model of human interaction that was developed by psychiatrist Dr. Steve Karpman. In it, he talks about these three primary roles that people can occupy in the midst of conflict. And those three roles are the persecutor, the rescuer, and the victim. Now, as we look at these three roles, a person can occupy any of these three roles at any given time, depending on the relationship, depending on the context of the conflict, depending on the relationship between the two people and the circumstance. Not everybody will necessarily occupy all of these roles, but everyone has the potential to occupy any and all of these roles. This model was developed in the context of conflict. And what we can see is if we were to expand that out, this can happen in the context of any interaction beyond conflict. It can become a role, it can become a dynamic that happens. So if you think about it in family atmospheres, there's first child, firstborn, middle child, baby of the family dynamics. And if you have multiples, 4, 5, 6 siblings, then you have spectrum of that first, middle, baby, and then everything in between dynamic of interaction. And inside of those interactions, each family member, they form a role. They form an identity inside of that role. Well, the same thing can happen inside of the dynamic as it pertains to these three roles, the persecutor, the victim, and the rescuer. As an example, let's just say I have two other siblings, right? So let's just say two of my siblings get into a tiff or a conflict, and one of them sits in the persecutor role. And that persecutor can look like, the aggressive, can be like the yelling at the aggressor, that fight response. that we've talked about in the survival responses that happen when there's a detected threat. And then you have your victim, the person who is not only being victimized, but also occupies the role of victim. And that role can look like, why me? Why are you doing this to me? It could be guilting. It could be shaming. And then you have what some might call the mediator, but in this context is called the rescuer, that comes in and it's like, break it up now. Come on now. This is not how we do. We are family. And so in the context, if I'm using me and my sisters, like I know that I tend to occupy more of the rescuer role, right? In the context, let's say, of my mom and my sisters, I will occupy more of the rescuer role. And my mom, she might occupy any of these roles, right? She could occupy the rescuer at times. Sometimes she's the mom, so she might occupy the persecutor role. And then sometimes it's like, oh, my ungrateful children, right? It's a cultural thing. And then my sisters, even in the dynamics with my mom, or sometimes even the dynamics with me, want to maybe occupy the persecutor role. And so you might see or hear yourself in these roles. Now, I'm talking about the family role, but this can happen in the friend role. You may have a best friend, and maybe there's some codependency that is unrecognized. And what that looks like is maybe the friend is always getting themselves into a bind, and you're always rescuing them out of that bind. And if you don't rescue them out of that bind, then they become the persecutor and they attack you for not rescuing them. And so that this is how people can shift roles depending on behavior. It could look like in an organization between leader and colleague, or between colleague to colleague. It can look like you have, maybe a worker who does really good work and a worker who is maybe struggling a little bit, and a leader who is very toxic. And so the leader may come in and be the persecutor role and always scolding and demeaning one particular worker who may be struggling a little bit with certain, maybe they're having some things going on at home that's affecting their performance, but instead of the leader inquiring like what's going on, they're in that sort of toxic persecutor role. And you might have another coworker who is in that rescuer role. And so you have this dynamic. The point is that this dynamic is not only traumatizing, it can be re-traumatizing. And wherever we go, whatever role that we tend the most toward occupying, and as you listen, you may be hearing yourself like, oh yeah, I'm definitely the rescuer, or oh, you know what, I could sometimes feel like I'm the victim, or oh, you know what, I definitely have seen myself in the persecutor role. You may occupy one of these roles. Wherever you go, you tend to take this, if you're unaware, you tend to take this role with you because it is the default in times of stress. And so it's important to recognize that, because if you are at home a rescuer, or if you are at home a person who feels victimized and tends to be in that role, then when you go into a workspace, and oftentimes people who are sort of in that victim space, they tend to oscillate between victim and persecutor. Because if you think about it, the anger and sort of the underlying dissatisfaction that builds up, if they occupy a role of power, there is risk of them bringing that displaced emotion into their role of power and actually becoming the persecutor. So you can actually have those people who are maybe victims in one circumstance actually become persecutors in a different circumstance, right? And those who are persecutors in one circumstance can become victims in another circumstance, right? And also, people can go from persecutor to rescuer. It's not as common to go from rescuer to victim necessarily. It can happen, but it's more common for the persecutor role to sort of oscillate in and out of other roles. And so I think what's important is to begin to recognize these roles, because whatever your default is, you're going to carry with you. And when you feel your body, and this is where I think it's so important for that emotional intelligence connection to come in, is because we can feel that shift in our body, and we can feel ourselves being drawn into this drama triangle in whatever circumstances. The way to break the triangle is to notice that it's happening, and then to step out of the role. You can notice that it's happening. You can even name it, like, okay, we're not going to do the persecutor victim thing today. Let's step out of this role and let's talk about this. Let's talk about what's really going on underneath. Let's dig into the root of it. And so when we look at, or especially in organizations and teams where this dynamic is going on, the persecutor, the victim, the rescuer, when that dynamic is going on in organizations, what's very powerful is to have a person who can then step out of that role, right? I'm not going to be the victim today. I'm going to say, what's really going on? Or to catch yourself in the persecutor mode and say, you know what, let me step back and say, what's really going on with me that I'm occupying that role? Or for the rescuer to say, nope, I'm not going to come in and rescue. I'm going to name what's happening right now between the two of you all, and let's see what's really going on. And so when you begin to recognize the pattern, you can name the pattern. It's very similar to like reconnecting to our emotional intelligence. When you can recognize, then you can begin to name that pattern and have the emotional awareness and courage to be able then acknowledge the pattern and then mend, like really go into repair if there's been harm done, and adapt behavior, right? And this takes practice, right? So it's the first step, though, is always going to be recognition. And even sometimes in the moment, it may not be the time to name it. It may be the time to pull back and reflect, right? You can press pause. You can say, you know what? I'm noticing something, but I need to pull back. And then that's the time to reflect, to connect to that emotional awareness, to that emotional flexibility, that courage, and then come back in with mirroring and modeling what we want to see, and to repair, mending whatever harm has been done, engaging in that repair process, and acknowledging and adapting behavior. So this is how we begin to break down those dynamics of the drama triangle, and how we avoid and mitigate re-traumatization or traumatization, how we break the cycles of trauma that happen in these interactions. It starts with the recognition. And that recognition oftentimes is in our bodies before we can actually process it in our brains. So what I invite you to do this week, because I'm always going to give you invited opportunity work, is to first of all notice when there's tension rising in the body, and start to reflect on, like, in relationships that feel constantly tense. Not all relationships have a drama triangle, by the way. Just want to make sure I make that clear. I'm not suggesting that all of our relationships were one of these things. But in those relationships that you have a dynamic, you have a role, there may be some codependency, there may be some constant tension. Reflect, what one of these roles could I be occupying? And what does it feel like in the body when I'm in that dynamic? And then begin to sort of like, what is the emotion connected to my body feeling when I'm in that dynamic? And what can I do? You mentally rehearse, what can I do in those moments to take a step back to reflect, to take a step back to really emotionally regulate? And what does it look like to then name and acknowledge what's happening, to begin to model and mirror something different, and to practice having those conversations? All right. This is the drama triangle. We probably have all experienced it in some way, form, or fashion. We may be experiencing it at times even now, today in our lives. So let's reflect on where we can start to step out of the triangle and create some healing. All right. I invite you to share this episode with a friend, with a colleague, with a family member, because right now we are in a season where we need to be connecting with our emotional intelligence, and we need to be communicating in ways that connect us and bring us together, that repair rather than rip us apart, because we have enough of that going on. So please share this episode. If you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and subscribe or follow this podcast, because we're going to be having a lot more deep conversations in this way. And I'm committed to providing little snippets, little tools, little empowerments that will help you to connect with the people in your lives in a much more deep and meaningful way. So, with that, I look forward to hearing what results or what reflections you have from this episode. And until the next time I see you, stay empowered.